In? Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Jess. Thanks for coming today. This is the third quarterly town hall that Senator Pocock is holding this year. It's been a fantastic way to hear firsthand from the community about what matters most to you guys. And we've got a lot planned for this afternoon. As always, the main purpose of this event is so Dave can hear from you guys directly and answer some questions. There's also been a lot going on inside and outside Parliament. Dave's keen to update you guys on, so we'll do that afterwards as well. And we also have a guest speaker this afternoon, Alan Kirkland, in the shadows here somewhere. There he is. He is the CEO of Choice, and he's here to talk about the cost of living crisis and what can be done to help support the community through this time. But before we continue with formal proceedings, I would like to invite our local Ngunnawal elder, Selena Walker, to say a few words. Thanks, Selena.
Thank you. Yuma, Kalkalnya Jelena Walker, Darawa Nuna Darawa Nunawo. Hello, my name is Selena Walker, and this is Ngunnawal Country. I'd like to first start by acknowledging my elders, the Ngunnawal elders, and pay respect to my elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the recent passing of my grandmother, Auntie Agnes Shea, who was the most senior Ngunnawal elder here. She was a little old black woman, but she did get around, so I'm sure you've crossed paths at some point. I'd also like to acknowledge Senator Pocock, and I already forgot your name, I'm sorry. I'm so bad with names, it's embarrassing. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us here this afternoon. Welcome my brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles, and I'd like to extend that to all of our non-Indigenous friends that have joined us, welcome. The Ngunnawal community are the traditional custodians of Canberra and the region. You may not be aware that the Ngunnawal Nation is made up of several family groups and not just individuals who represent this country. Therefore, as a community, we have an elected body known as the United Ngunnawal Elders Council to represent us, along with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body of the ACT. It's important for you to understand and acknowledge, for our identity is a collective identity. There are other Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from around the nation, the country and the world who've come to live on Ngunnawal land. I would like to acknowledge and welcome you all. The tradition of welcoming the people to country is a practice that was handed down by our ancestors, old people and elders from the beginning of time. Before entering another person's country, you would first announce your arrival and not enter until a traditional owner formally welcomed you. The reason for this practice was to protect your spirit whilst in another person's country and also to show respect for the country which you were entering. It's wonderful to see this practice is now recognised and respected. But it's not like entering into someone's home unless you're first invited. The Ngunnawal people, as within all Aboriginal people, have a great heritage that we would like to share with all Australians from every walk of life. As you are aware, Canberra means meeting place, and Canberra has been a place of gathering for many Aboriginal tribes of Australia to come together, still with important business and also for ceremonial purposes. Our Ngunnawal ancestors believed in the importance of people gathering to build relationships, share knowledge, and to celebrate the gift of heritage and history. We believe it's important for all to recognise our unique history, and again, an understanding that our land is our heritage and how loss of the land has disconnected so many Aboriginal people from their spiritual links, cultural heritage and identity. Reconciliation is not just a word, it is an action, and it's a human rights movement. We need people to join that human rights movement. As an Aboriginal person in this country, I've only been counted as a human being for 56 years. Let me repeat that while that sinks in. As a beautiful Black woman in Australia, I have only been counted as a human being for 56 years. I'm only 42. We're very young in our reconciliation journey, but we're on the right path. By incorporating proper cultural protocols like welcome to country, smoking ceremonies, etc., we're on the road to true reconciliation. It does hurt, however, that my dad was born a tree. My grandmother became a mother before she became a human being in this country. The upcoming referendum is an opportunity, another milestone in our reconciliation journey. I'm not going to try and sway your vote either way, but I will say this. If we change nothing, nothing is going to change. If we change nothing, nothing is going to change. We've been doing the same stuff in this country for a long time, expecting a different result. I want change. It's time for change. Thank you. 65% of Australians have never met an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. That scares me, because they're the ones that are making this decision. So I encourage you all to go out and get informed. Go out and get your questions answered. Go out and get your concerns addressed. So come voting day, we can all make a fully informed decision with no regrets. I don't want my boys to come back to me in 20 years' time and say, why didn't you vote a particular way? No regrets. This is not an election. This is a vote for First Nations justice. I stand on the shoulders of giants, and I need to honour them. We need to honour them. So as I said, go out and get informed so that we can make a truly informed vote, decision for this country, for the future of our kids, with no regrets come voting day. So thank you once again for inviting me here to do the Welcome to Country. That was very heavy, so, you know, take a breath. It's all good. You're not in trouble. Unfortunately, can't stay for the rest of the event. I have left my 3 teenage boys at home. So it's state of origin in my living room probably at the moment. So go Queensland. Well done to the organisers. This is a great opportunity. We appreciate you giving your time, David, and thank you all for coming and raising your voice for the future of Canberra. And now I will finish, as my grandmother always did, in the words of my people, the Ngunnawal people. Yumalandi Yununga Yerabu Yungu, which means you may leave footprints on our land now. Or in other words, welcome to country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Selena, for welcoming us onto this beautiful country and a reminder of what an important opportunity we have this year. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. We are fortunate to have with us Alan Kirkland, who has travelled to Canberra for this event to discuss the cost of living crisis, which continues to worsen, leaving many members of our community under constant financial, mental and emotional pressure. Choice is Australia's national consumer organisation, and Alan has been its CEO since 2012. Before joining Choice, Alan worked as CEO of Legal Aid New South Wales, Executive Director of the Australian Law Reform Commission, and the Executive Director of the New South Wales Council of Social Service. Alan also has a long background of involvement in Australian civil society organisations and is currently a Director of the Foundation for Young Australians. Please welcome Alan Kirkland. Thank you. Sorry, welcome Alan, but also just quickly, we've got a few people arriving late. So I'm just wondering if you guys want to scooch on down, we'll just take a moment for that. And maybe if you're on the road, just like scooch out so they can fit in. That's okay. Or you guys can sit at the back if you want. They're good. Okay. Welcome, Alan. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. I want to acknowledge that marvellous welcome to country and acknowledge that we're all here on Ngunnawal country and pay respects to elders past and present and to any First Nations people here today. I should actually ask, are there any Choice members in the room? This is the thing I love about my job. I can't go anywhere with a group this size without meeting a few. And Choice is, as you said in the intro, our national consumer organisation. We've been around since 1959, 1960, and it's always been part of our work to help people to choose products, which is how we're best known, but also to work as part of the policy process to make sure that we've got the right laws in place that ensure that you'll be treated fairly when you go about your life as a consumer. I'm going to talk just briefly about the cost of living crisis and happy to expand later in the Q&A if there are things that people want to ask about. But I think when looking at cost of living, it's important to look at the different drivers or what's happening in different categories or sectors of goods and services, because there are quite different factors driving increased cost of living, driving inflation. And that means there are different things that you can do as an individual consumer, but also the policy levers available to government and to the parliament are very different. Obviously, the most important area of expenditure is housing, the largest area of expenditure for all households. And even within housing, you've got quite different issues driving cost of housing for people who are homeowners versus people who are renters. Obviously, for people who've got mortgages, the key factor driving up their mortgage payments is the Reserve Bank's attempts to bring down inflation by increasing interest rates. Hopefully, we're getting towards the end of that. The economic consensus seems to be that those rate rises might have peaked, or there may only be one more in store. Nobody can predict that accurately, as we know, but there is some hope that we might be getting towards the end of that. For renters, though, and I'm conscious housing is a very hot issue at the moment in the Parliament, but for renters, very different factors. It's fundamentally about a mismatch between supply and demand, or, a long-term undersupply of housing in Australia. And that was an issue before COVID, but then with COVID, we had periods of lockdown, which meant that construction stopped. There was a slowdown in new construction starting. We then had supply chain pressures that meant that building materials weren't getting through. They're still not coming through at the same rate. And we've had labour shortages. So just this storm of things meant something that was already a big problem has become a much bigger problem. And then on the demand side, we've had the return of immigration, and particularly at the start of this year, the return of many international students, which our universities are very grateful for, obviously, but it just had a huge impact on demand for housing, aggravating what already was a problem. And this is probably the one that worries me the most, because you can't fix housing supply quickly. It's a very long-term, we've got to start as soon as we can, but it's a very long-term thing to address. But supply is a big part of it, and ensuring there's some affordable housing supply as part of the solution is really important. The next, another significant area of household expenditure is obviously energy costs, including fuel costs. There, it's fundamentally about the war in Ukraine driving up the cost of coal, gas, and oil. Obviously, the ACT is reasonably well sheltered from that. The best placed jurisdiction in the country because of the push to renewables over the last decade. But for people who are dependent on gas, you will be seeing those massive hikes in gas prices come through. And I think the ACT government's efforts to really push electrification and trying to help people to shift to use of electrical appliances in their homes is a really important way to help people. And if you haven't seen it, they've got a great website called Make Your Next Choice Electric, which they've done in partnership with us. So they've got a range of tools that help you to understand the sort of choices you can make if you've got the ability to make some changes to the appliances around your home, what they'll cost, and also what the savings will be to you over time. Another area that Choice has been looking at in terms of cost of living is the cost of insurance. I'm sure that any of you who've received a renewal notice would have seen increases of 20, 30%, maybe more, depending on where you live. The Actuaries Institute put out a report last week that said the median increase in home and contents insurance premiums across the country has been 30% in the last year. So that's massive. And the key thing that's driving this is really comes down to climate change. It's the increase in the severity and frequency of events like floods, bushfires, cyclones across the world that is driving up the cost of reinsurance, but also within Australia, we've had obviously some really big events in the last couple of years that are driving up the cost of insurance, the prices that insurers are applying. Again, it's a big, messy problem. Choice has put out our own report looking at some of the policy solutions in that space. And then finally, I think across a whole range of markets in Australia, and this is particularly important for groceries, one of the key reasons that we've seen inflation is we don't have enough competition in lots of our markets. So Australia is quite unusual in that in almost all of our core markets are dominated by 2 to 4 large players. If you think about it, airlines, banks, even insurance, there are lots of brands on the front of insurance, but actually when you boil it down, there's only a handful of insurers behind them. And ultimately what that means is we end up paying more. It's one of those areas where economic theory, I think, serves us well. If there's not enough competition, then consumers end up bearing the cost of that. And that's, I think there is some evidence of that. That is one of the reasons that the grocery prices are going up. It's not the only reason, but we're certainly not seeing any kind of dent in the profits that those major firms like the supermarket chains are reporting as they head into reporting season. So a range of different things driving cost of living. Just briefly in terms of some of the things that you can do. If you are struggling to pay your bills, then there is great assistance available. Or if anyone in your family or neighbourhood is struggling, there is a network of financial counsellors funded by the government across the country. You can get to them through the National Debt Helpline if you just look for it on the web, or their phone number is 1800 007 007. And these are really well-trained people who are excellent at helping people to sort through their finances and work out arrangements in order to put themselves in the best position. So I strongly recommend that to anyone who might be struggling. Similarly, anybody who's struggling with a mortgage, the most important thing you can do is speak to your bank as soon as possible. And the banks have gotten a lot better at recent years at helping people in financial hardship. They can do things like extend the term of a mortgage, and they'd much rather find a way to help people continue paying their mortgage in some way than end up having to repossess a property, because ultimately everybody loses out then. So just a really important reminder again to anybody you might know that's struggling to reach out as soon as possible. Shopping around might seem like a simple tip, but it can actually result in significant savings. When it comes to energy bills, there's an excellent website provided by the federal government called Energy Made Easy, where you can upload your latest power bill, and it will sort through all of the deals on the market that are available in your area and tell you what the costs will be based on your actual consumption. This is a relatively new thing. It's what you need in order to understand energy, and I really encourage people to do that the next time you get a bill if you haven't changed retailers recently. Similarly with insurance, while we're seeing those 20-30% premium increases, we also know that insurers are the best industry of all what we call the loyalty tax. So they chronically overcharge long-term customers. So if you've been with the same insurer and haven't contacted them about changing for any more than about 3 years, I can guarantee you'll be paying more than you need to. And there can be quite significant savings from simply shifting to another insurer. So absolutely worth doing. And finally, just to go back to my initial point, just being really careful about how you use debt. We know we've got a problem at the moment with lots of people in financial hardship using buy now, pay later, which is an unregulated form of debt. Lots of people getting into trouble with that. I guess we encourage people to be aware that particularly those buy now, pay later products are not regulated like credit cards or personal loans. So lenders don't need to take the same steps to make sure you can afford to repay. But if you do land in trouble, there is assistance there, and please reach out and make use of it, and encourage those in your family and neighbourhood to do the same. So thank you for the opportunity to share a few of those thoughts, and I'm happy to pick up any other issues in the Q&A in a little bit. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alan. As Alan mentioned, we will have some questions afterwards, but for now, I'd like to invite Senator David Pocock to the stage to speak on cost of living, outline some recent wins, flag some upcoming things. Thanks.
Thanks, Jess. Good. And thank you, Alan, for that, and for making the effort to get to Canberra for today. I do want to thank Selena for the welcome, acknowledge her and elders past and present. Such an incredible part of Australia, and absolutely love living here, and very grateful for the work that Ngunnawal have done and continue to do in looking after this land. I'm going to try and compress me speaking so we can get to questions. So we'll start with the parliamentary update. I've introduced my first two private senators' bills. The first one was a duty of care bill. Currently, the government has no duty of care to young people and future generations when they make decisions that will affect the climate that young people live through and that future generations inherit. We saw the last government argue that they didn't have a duty of care and overturned a court case where Anjali Sharma and a group of young people took the former Environment Minister to court. I think it's frankly ridiculous that politicians can argue that they don't have a duty of care. If we're not there to make decisions that are good for young people and our long-term future, then what's the point? What's the point of having politicians? So we're really keen to push this hard and make sure that we are changing the way we make decisions, to be thinking about the effect it's going to have on our children and their children going forward. So you can find out more at the website there. Sign the petition. It has gone to a Senate committee for inquiry, so you're very welcome to put in a submission and tell anyone you know who may be interested to put in a submission. I'll get to the next bill, but the other thing we've launched is a vision for Canberra, and you can check that out at visionforcanberra.com. Over the last year, we've been consulting with Canberrans, people in the wider Canberra region, businesses, peak bodies, about what do we need to do as a city to set ourselves up for the future. It's no surprise that of the 4 pillars that came out, housing was number 1. People want more housing and crucially more affordable housing. The next one was events. As the nation's capital, we can't host anything big really. We've got all these conferences going to Sydney and Melbourne. The ANU is taking conferences to Sydney because we simply can't host them. And this has been the case for a long time now, a couple of decades. So our convention centre, we've watched the Matildas play no games in Canberra. This is something that as a growing city we should address. The third one is innovation. Canberra has the most startups per capita in the country. As a way to foster innovation and diversify our economy, grow the private sector, it's a real opportunity. And so I've been talking to a range of stakeholders and experts about the need for innovation precinct and some advanced manufacturing facilities so more startups can actually stay in Canberra. You talk to these startups, they're desperate to be able to stay. Often it just comes down to space and not being able to produce, manufacture things here. And the last one is transport. People want accessible public transport. So those 4 things, we're going to continue to push them. We've seen the Chief Minister and the Prime Minister now announce the National Capital Investment Framework, NCIF. No more details than that, but it's a start. And I'm really keen to keep pushing them for infrastructure that makes sense for Canberra. And if you check out the website, it is broader than that. There is sort of community sporting infrastructure that we're hearing from, people in Woden, people further south that is desperately needed. The second private centres bill is to do with the Copyright Act. Currently, commercial radio can spend a maximum of 1% of revenue to recording artists. This is a historical cap that 5 separate reviews have recommended be done away with. I believe that artists should be able to negotiate for their copyright, for their radio play. And so we're sort of pushing the major parties to listen to the experts and the reviews that are saying that it should be a level playing field. We had a big rally against Middle Arm in Parliament, thanks to anyone who came along and helped organise it. There's $1.5 billion of federal funding going to a gas processing hub on Darwin Harbour, 3 kilometres from the suburbs of Darwin, and looking at the immediate health impacts on Darwin from gas processing. You're looking at a likely 30% increase in childhood leukemia, increases in asthma, cardiovascular disease, stillbirths, some really horrifying health impacts. There will also be health impacts on Indigenous communities in the Beetaloo, where the gas will come from, and it's going to affect our climate. The Beetaloo Basin is 500 trillion cubic feet of gas, an extraordinary amount of gas that they're hoping to pipe to Darwin and export. Territory representation, this is something that Professor Kim Rubenstein pushed really hard in the election and really got it on the radar. And we are now in a position where at the Labor conference, they've endorsed an increase to Senate representation, which is a great step forward. I've been arguing that we should, rather than just giving us 1 or 2 extra senators. Let's legislate a ratio of between a third and a half of the states, which I think is fairly, is pretty fair, and would mean that in a decade or two, we're not having to, go to the government again, trying to get better representation. The Senate is the place where smaller jurisdictions should have a say, so they're not just bulldozed by the more populous states. And I think there's a strong argument for the territories to now have that. And that's simply legislation. It's not in the Constitution, so it can happen when the government decides to do it. And then there was the 60-day dispensing disallowance. We've done a lot of work talking to pharmacists across the ACT about concerns, many valid concerns that we spent a lot of time working with the minister and the department to address. Managed to get, I think, some good outcomes. And at the end of the day, the cost of living savings for people in Canberra, I believe it was the right thing to not disallow that instrument. It would have caused chaos, quite frankly, had that happened. So really grateful to Rory and Fiona and my team for the huge amount of work that they did on that. So just following on from Alan's presentation, we've been in touch with a number of these food pantries. They've never seen so much demand. And I think one of the really sad things that we keep hearing is that for a lot of people, there's a lot of shame in accessing food pantries. I think particularly people it's the first time that they've ever had to do that. But it would really encourage anyone who needs to go and get support there or knows someone to really direct them to one of the food pantries in the ACT. Housing, yes, housing is the biggest issue, and we'll continue to push federally for more action in this area. There are a number of services and programs where people can get in touch. And just on Alan's point, having met with the Banking Association, I think it was, and a couple of the banks, their advice is get in touch early before you are sort of in stress when it comes to your mortgage. Get in touch, let them know, and they do seem very willing to try and find a solution to that. There's some amazing services in Canberra. From Roundabout Canberra, who are doing just such cool work, working with new families in helping them getting kitted out with really good quality and fully sort of safety tested gear, to Vinnie's Green Shed. On the energy bills, Alan mentioned a couple of things that the ACT government are doing. There's also the discounted land rates for pensioners that is worth checking out if you qualify for that. There's clearly the need for the immediate, but as Alan said, this is something that is really caused by a lack of vision and action from politicians over a while now. And there are things that we can be doing. We need more investment in electrification. We need to ensure that low-income households aren't left behind, that there are the right incentives and supports to ensure that people can save money. It's not just the wealthier Australians who are able to drive an electric vehicle and use the solar on their roof to wash the dishes and do the laundry. As we're building these houses that have been committed to being built as part of the Housing Australia Future Fund and the Accord, they need to have better energy efficiency standards. So something that we have to get on board. We're so far behind places like Europe as a country. There's lots of resistance to it, but this is the direction we have to move in. Investment in social housing, clearly a federal and state and territory issue. Here in the territory, one of the wealthier jurisdictions and we've got the highest rate of persistent homelessness in the country. We should all be really embarrassed, if not ashamed, about that. And we really do need to do more to address it and have more social and affordable housing close to services, centrally located where people live and work. To the next one, maybe. That's it. Was there one more slide? I've got an extra one here. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there and we'll open up to questions because I know there's a bunch on Slido and I'm sure people have their own. So how do you want to do this?
Okay, cool. Question time. We've got two ways for these guys to answer questions. Can I invite Alan back to the stage? Thank you. So Dave and the team have asked the community for the past couple of weeks to submit some questions. They're on Slido now. So you can't ask more questions on there, but you can do it here. If you would like to upvote questions that are on here and tell us which ones you're more interested in, just scan that QR code with your smartphone now, and then you can like things, and then we can figure out which ones you want them to answer. The other thing you can do is just put your hand up. Great. Do you want to do this or this first? Slide it, great.
Top one.
Okay, so the first question is, what can we do to make sure everyone will vote yes on The Voice?
It's hard to add much to what Selena said. This really is about being informed and understanding what you're being asked the referendum. I think it's a bit disrespectful to Australians and our democracy to say, if you don't know, vote no. Like, if you don't know, find out. And I would urge people to find out what is being asked and find out the history of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. First Nations people from across the country saying to Australians, not to politicians, to all Australians, we want recognition in the Constitution and we want a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. That's what's being asked. You know, the details of what the Voice of Parliament look like will be legislated by the Parliament as the Parliament decides all the other matters where there's a little placeholder in the Constitution, and then the Parliament decides what that looks like, and over time changes it. So yes. Spot on. So it's an advisory body. It's not going to legislate. The Parliament will have supremacy over, and you know, we know that governments don't necessarily take advice. Exactly. And that's the difference now, is we will hopefully have the advice and be able to see if the government's taking it seriously. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point for people who can't hear. First Nations people have asked that this is enshrined in the Constitution because there is quite a history in Australia of these bodies being stood up, and then when the government doesn't like them or thinks there's issues, of just shutting them down. And yes.
Great. The other thing you didn't ask me, but the question, what you could do is tell your friends. I heard some great stat that was like, if everyone who was already voting yes told one or two people, we'd get there. So have a chat.
Yeah, speak to your mates, speak to your loved ones. We've put a bunch of information on my website, some sort of frequently asked questions and some resources, and then Yes 23. You'll hopefully start to see them out and about in Canberra. So stop and have a chat.
Cool. Another slide. Great. The next question is, how do we better monitor the corruption in government and in the APS effectively and transparently so robo-debt doesn't happen again? Dave.
Yeah, great question. We've seen, robo-debt, I think, has really shown the need for one, the NAC, the Anti-Corruption Commission, which we now have, but I think crucially for better whistleblower protection laws so that people can actually come forward. It's no good having a great National Anti-Corruption Commission if the people who are public servants or know about things that are going on don't have the protection to come forward and inform the process. And horrifying what is sort of come to light through the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. And we have to ensure that we put things in place to ensure that that doesn't happen again. And I really believe a big part of that is whistleblower protections. We're currently prosecuting Richard Boyle and David McBride, two whistleblowers who went through the various channels, tried to tick all the boxes under the current act, and are now being prosecuted by the Commonwealth. And we have an Attorney General who says he's committed to whistleblower reform, but is still prosecuting these two whistleblowers, destroying their lives, putting a huge strain on them and their families. I'll continue to push for those prosecutions to be dropped, and I think urgently updating our whistleblower protection laws. The Attorney General has said that there will be another tranche of laws, but they need to happen soon.
Thank you.
But I think, I think one of the big issues is individual accountability within the public service. They are faceless opportunists who use their power and completely hide away from that alleged transparent accountability. And I think one of the things we need to do is get rid of faceless and make sure that people who sign off on having made a decision that affects a citizen or a taxpayer is accountable for the reasoning behind those sign-offs.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying there. I think for me, it's part of it is the way that the public service has been eroded over time. And I think talking to people who've been in there for a long time, the culture of sort of frank and fearless advice is now sort of the government saying, this is what we want you to do, just make this happen. And I think there's been that cultural shift. I would love us to start moving back towards the point where public servants are giving frank and fearless advice and are standing up when they get told to implement an illegal scheme, are not. And if some are, then others are blowing the whistle on it. But I take your point. Thank you.
From the crowd, okay. Okay, we're going 3D. If you would like a question answered, please raise your hand and someone will come find you.
Hi, you mentioned earlier about future and young people, and that's particularly with climate change and things like that. I'm a bit worried. The Tuggeranong Community Council ran a youth forum here this year in May, which we invited students from the 10 high schools and colleges here in Tuggeranong. We had various tables. One was environment and climate change, and we had the CEO of the Environment Centre facilitated it. And she came up to me and she said she was shocked at a couple of things. And the major thing was that while in primary schools, there's things about climate change and environment, but in high schools, there is not much. Some high schools and colleges are doing stuff, some aren't. It's not enough in our curriculum, our national curriculum. It's something we really need to be pushing because kids are confused. They don't know much, or they know the negativities. They don't know the positivities. And sometimes it depends upon the teacher. The teacher's interested whether it's taught. So we really need to look at that so that the kids are properly educated with these issues.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think ecological literacy is important for all of us to know more about our home, the place that we live in, being able to interact with the landscape and, you know, be good stewards of this land. So I don't know the ins and outs of the curriculum here, but certainly something we can look at across the country. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's chat after this. I'd love to chat more. Thank you.
Sweet, okay. More hands up.
Sorry. Thanks for your time today, Senator. Just to clarify, are you in support of 60-day scripts or not? And when you consulted about it, did you talk to pensioners and people on low incomes? Because you said that you talked to pharmacists about it.
Yes, I'm in favour of 60-day dispensing, and that's why I voted against the disallowance. I guess if you're a pensioner or someone on low income, you obviously want 60 days because you're going to, you know, save a lot of money. The angst was from pharmacists, and so that's where we did a lot of consultation. And particularly here in the ACT, there was a particular part of it when it comes to the opiate dependence treatment program, where because the ACT had an existing program, there were some pharmacists that were going to lose money. And so we worked really hard between the federal and the ACT health minister to ensure that there was a transition there, and pharmacists who are doing the right thing and in many cases, you know, going above and beyond for people on sort of methadone treatment programs weren't out of pocket.
All right, next question. What do you want me to go? Yeah, go inside it. Okay, right. Next question is from the top. Should the PwC scandal be a catalyst to rebuild the public service expertise instead of outsourcing functions to line the pockets of the private sector companies?
Yes.
Great. Next.
It absolutely should be. I think one of the risks is that we just say all consultancy is bad. That's not the case. I think there's a very legitimate place for it, but clearly over time we've seen consultants doing really core parts of what should be the public service. And so I think there's a long way to go to rebuild the public service and ensure that when we are seeking advice or getting external people in, that it's good value for money. And I think really importantly, that we're getting the procurement right and that the smaller firms are able to compete with the big four, who we've seen just hoovering up enormous amounts of contracts. I think over the last 10 years, it's gone up 1,200% or so. So yeah, absolutely something that we should be looking at. A few weeks ago, there was a great Utopia headline where I think it was the Department of Finance maybe had paid consultants to advise them on how to engage consultants. So there's a long way to go. I know, you know, Minister Gallagher and others are working on this, and yeah, as an independent, we'll continue to push that we get this right. Question about efficiency dividends. I think for the smaller, so say for the national cultural institutions, having an efficiency dividend is just ridiculous. When you're a small entity, the only way you get more efficient is by shedding staff. And we're asking them to do more and more, have more and more visitors with less and less staff. For the bigger departments, there's potentially more of an argument for a small efficiency dividend. But you know, you'd hope that we are valuing the public service and investing in it and sort of seeing the return that has for Australians in being able to access services.
Thank you. We'll just go one from the floor and then we'll do our south side question too. So, oh yeah, we got a question here.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for today. With regard to housing, we're going to have a lot being built, hopefully, but over the next couple of years. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is that we don't build more heat sinks by having small blocks, huge houses, black roofs, no trees. And I don't know where that kind of stuff can be managed from, but I think it really does need to be seen and managed.
Thanks for the question. It's a travesty that we're building suburbs that we know will never have enough tree cover. Looking at some of the sort of projected tree cover for a few of the new suburbs, it's pretty woeful. You're looking around 20%. Canberra has a target of 30%. I think Sydney has a target of over 40%. And climate adaptation is something we're going to have to be spending a lot more money on. And when we're building housing, we've got to be building it for the next 50 years. And we're setting people up for failure to be doing that. You know, just going for the sort of financial return at the expense of people who are going to be living in those areas. So yeah, I really think we have to be building in a way that is much smarter, that will be able to withstand the sort of climate fueled disasters, but is also a good place to live in, and it's, you know, easier to be heated and cooled. So yeah. Yeah.
I imagine that some of that state government responsibilities, I don't imagine that the federal government automatically would have input into that stuff, but
So
it feels so urgent.
There's the building code, which is up for renewal, being negotiated. And one of the things is going to 7-star, sorry. But things like canopy cover targets and, you know, the colors of roofs and all that sort of thing, that's very much a territory issue. I'd encourage you to get in touch with the housing minister about that.
Sweet. Okay, so we'll just go to our last Slido question. Why does all the money seem to go to central Canberra and north side rather than Tuggeranong and south side? Tuggeranong gets neglected.
Yep. It's a great question. We know that you look at the last 10 years of growth in Canberra, there's been huge growth in the Gungahlin, the sort of north side area, and the population density is sort of shifting north. That's no excuse to not invest in the south side and Tuggeranong. And we've been doing consultations, hearing about things like the Phillip Pool, you know, things just places around Woden just being neglected and not invested in. During the election campaign, we were talking about the need for more investment down south, things like having a better sort of community sports ground to draw more events down into the south. But I would love to hear ideas and concerns as part of the vision for Canberra. There are a range of projects, if you look on there, a number on the south side as well, but would love to hear your concerns and thoughts. Obviously, most of it is sort of territory investment, but where there is a federal component, or if you'd like me to convey concerns to territory reps, I'm very happy to do that.
Great, thank you. More questions from the floor?
Thank you both for coming and organising the event. I've actually got a question for Alan, please, which is, does Choice have a position or a view on the housing bill? And also to David, in your campaign, you were subject to false information about your background and beliefs and such. And we hear that the No campaign essay is full of factual errors. Now, people make a different decision, that's one thing, but to be misled into a decision in our democracy, that's, you know, that's horrible. So what can we do to actually prevent false information where people make a decision on the wrong thing, on incorrect things?
So on the housing bill, we haven't been involved directly in the debates around that, but I would say, if I go back to what I said at the beginning, it is clear that a lack of supply is a key problem that's driving up cost of housing. So we really need to be prioritising things that will actually increase supply and get that moving as soon as possible. And we generally work with some of the really established housing groups like National Shelter, and they are very clearly in favour of the housing bill. And I would defer very much to their advice because they're, I guess they're talking to the economists that are involved in housing policy. They've got a very well-rounded view. They also have a strong focus on how we best address the housing needs of people on low to middle incomes. And so, yeah, I defer very much to their advice, and they're in favour of the bill.
If you,
Sorry.
sorry, if you,
Grab the mic if you're going to ask a question.
sorry, if you want to just wait for the mic and then people online can hear your question too. Thank you. And also,
Yeah, truth in political advertising. You know, there's ways to tackle it, and I'm really hopeful that the Labor government will. They've said that as part of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters sort of review process, looking at the last election, then maybe that'll be part of the mix. I hope it is. When this referendum machinery bill was coming through, which basically just sets up the referendum, we were pushing them on fact checking, saying, we've seen what happens in elections. Politicians are pretty shameless, the stuff that they are saying. And currently there's nothing to stop them. You can basically say whatever you want. So we said, let's have an independent fact checking process for both the yes and no pamphlets. And Labor didn't want to do that. And yeah, we're seeing it. We're seeing the misinformation being spread online, and there's nothing we can do other than call it out. And you know, one of the same groups that ran a bunch of campaign ads against me is now one of the bigger backers of the no vote.
One of your online questions is very similar to the one I brought with me. It mentions government services that families rely on seem to be getting harder to navigate and get kind of timely assistance. We recently had our first encounter with Centrelink in order to try to obtain senior health card. Number one, they have these online systems where you fill in the forms and everything works, but it doesn't. After 3 physical visits to Centrelink, we went home and basically tossed out everything they did it all over again, and finally got the submission done. And this relates to some of the other questions you've been answering about the APS being reduced in number, efficiency gains and all that, and having somebody build a system that supposedly works, but it doesn't. Fundamentally, people are more and more relying on true government services, and the government services aren't standing up to do the job. And it's not the people on the desk you meet, it's the systems, it's the whole fabric.
Yeah, it shouldn't be that hard. And I know this is something that the government is grappling with and really trying to work on, from everything from Department of Veterans Affairs to Services Australia to the NDIS. And we're constantly hearing stories of difficulty navigating the system, or if you're on the NDIS, talking to a different person every time who sort of doesn't know anything about your history. And so, yeah, I think it is something that needs a lot of work, and I know that various ministers are working on it. Again, I think part of it comes down to the way we think and talk about the public service. If people don't connect the service they get at Services Australia with good funding for the public service and a belief that public servants are doing great work for Australia and for all of us, then we can erode that, and it results in people being frustrated and not being able to navigate the system. So yeah, I don't have any solutions for you other than that. I know that there's a bunch of work being done on it, and we'll continue to push the government to ensure that it is about people and serving people.
My comment was to Alan, and I'm sorry I butted in. Look, you talk about supply of housing being a problem, but will Choice come out and ask the government to reform the tax distortions of negative gearing and capital gains tax discount that has pushed housing out of the reach of ordinary people in Australia? Because that seems to me to be at least as big an issue, if not a greater issue, than supply.
Yeah, Choice, it's a very good point to raise. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the applause. Choice doesn't traditionally work on tax issues, so we've not advocated for those reforms in the past. But where we have done work is we've done a lot of work in recent years around what's been happening to renters, even before this current sort of spike in rental costs. And one of the things we've pointed out is another thing that those tax concessions do is they've created a housing market that's largely where a huge amount of the supply in Australia of rentals is from individual private landlords. There's no other country in the world where you've got so much of the rental market that is actually provided by individual, effectively small business owners. And it creates a whole bunch of problems in terms of how renters are ultimately treated, which is why I think some of the measures that are being discussed at the moment are actually about trying to encourage more affordable housing that's sort of managed by community housing providers that have got the systems in place to manage housing in an appropriate way. And I think that's one way of trying to counteract some of the negative effects of those tax concessions that you mentioned.
I would love to see the major parties start to have this conversation. Between 2010 and 2020, there was over $110 billion worth of deductions from rental properties. And, I think clearly if housing is a human right and something that everyone in our community should be able to afford and not sort of just a wealth creation vehicle, then we have to look at tax and find a way to transition to a fairer system. And at the same time, look at the Commonwealth going back to what they have done historically in building more social and affordable housing, and have things like build to rent to buy schemes. So yeah, it has to be part of the conversation. And really frustratingly so far, haven't seen either of the major parties even up to debate it. Can I jump in for a question? Alan, I've got a question on supermarkets. This is something that we do get correspondence about. I'm interested what you think could be done. And one of the things that we have had a couple of people ask us about is even things as simple as Aldi putting their sort of prices online. Would that make a difference? Like, what are the things that we can be doing?
There are no easy solutions, but one thing that we've repeatedly highlighted is that the way that unit pricing in supermarkets works at the moment is not ideal. So we have got a code that says that they have to apply, display the unit price in supermarkets, but the requirements are very loose. That code hasn't been reviewed in some time. Some supermarkets and retailers are actually moving to electronic price labels, and they're dynamic ones, so they kind of can change them electronically in the store in real time. But some of them are even harder to read than some of the paper printed ones. So we'd like to see that code overhauled. So when people are shopping, you can actually more easily see which is the cheaper product. And then actually, I think the bigger solutions to this problem, supermarkets is a really concentrated market. The entry of Aldi has helped, But still, we've effectively got sort of, you know, 3 major players and then an independent network in Australia. And Rod Sims, the former head of the ACCC, has said he thinks it's quite likely that the major supermarket chains have increased their profits, put up prices more than they needed to during this period in a way that's bolstered their profits. And he says we actually need to overhaul our competition laws. So we actually make it harder for businesses to become that big and powerful within a market. And we ultimately need, Alan Fells, another former chair of the ACCC, has said that we need to consider actually introducing laws that allow courts to order that some business divest some of their assets if they become too big that we can actually break them up. So I think, you know, we need to be thinking about some of those more radical solutions, I think.
Senator, thanks for your time this afternoon. Forgive my laryngitis. Bouncing back to the truth in advertising, political parties lie like pigs in muck when it comes to electoral promises. Why is it that political advertising is not subject to the same standards of the Australian advertising that, say, a normal product would? If I've got a product and I advertise it, I've got to be truthful about it. Otherwise, my ad will not make it to air or I will be prosecuted. Why is political advertising exempt from that? The average person who watches Channel 7 and sees outright false information on The Voice or a politic isn't going to go on the ABC website and look for the fact check. They're just going to believe what they see on TV and they have no interest in actually delving any deeper. And I think that is a major danger for both constitutional change like The Voice, where there's so much disinformation that just isn't right, as well as a standard election process.
Well, I think the short answer is because politicians make the rules, and it's been inconvenient to sort of constrain what you can say. It kind of has worked for them to an extent, but I think there's now an awareness, growing awareness that it's not working for our democracy. And I think particularly with social media and how that has really changed sort of our societal discourse and the way that people talk to each other, there are real needs to put some parameters around that and try and ground it more in truth and fact. And you know, the other part of this with politicians making the rules is political parties are exempt from the Privacy Act. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Like, I think these are the sorts of things that we've really got to push the major parties on to raise the standard a bit and really improve our democracy over time.
Is that something you believe is achievable by an independent such as yourself, or is it going to die a death the first time through the Senate and the reps? Because people are just going to go, no, forget it. We like lying. It gets us back into power.
Well, there've been a number of independents pushing this. You know, Zali Steggall had a bill in the last parliament to deal with this, and it's continued to push in this new parliament. The Greens have pushed this in the past, and I think now across almost, I'd say the entire crossbench will be pushing this, and it'll be really interesting to see with the electoral reform laws which parts of that the coalition support and which parts the government will have to negotiate with the crossbench to get through. And I'm really hopeful that they're going to take this seriously and really value and improve our democracy. I think it's such a big opportunity.
David, I just wanted to start by congratulating you on the work that you've done so far. Absolutely fabulous. Over the past 70 years, the world's population has grown from 3.5 billion to 8 billion. That's a trend that's been mirrored in both Australia and the ACT. What we desperately need in the ACT is an environmentally sustainable population plan, but there's no leadership on that issue at either federal, state or territory election. And I note with a great deal of disappointment when you were talking about the vision for Canberra, that there's no mention of the environment in any of those 4 pillars. It really should be front and centre because it's what we all depend on. What can you do to get urgent action on this #1 issue for planet Earth?
Thanks for the question. this is obviously a thorny issue, and I think part of it is that if you have, talking to experts in this field, one of the big issue is around consumption, and I think when you start off by going at the population sort of level, there are people on Earth who are using an absolute fraction of the resources as me and many people in this room. So I think this is all tied into our way of life and how much resources we consume. But I think it is something that we should be able to have a conversation about here in Canberra, in Australia. And it's not something that I've seen people willing to debate, because I think for a range of reasons, if you look at our economic growth, a lot of it seems to be underpinned by migration and a growing population. We're not a very diverse economy. We're basically, a petro-state reliant on exporting resources, and into the future, that's going to become an issue. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there in making our economy more complex and having more industries doing some heavier lifting. But we've also got to face up to the fact, like for a place like Canberra, there's a limited amount of water and land. And what does that mean for us? As part of the vision for Canberra, one of the things that I think is critical is urban infill in places that make sense. And so looking at the City to Lake proposal, where you bury Parks Way and you can have a whole heap of people close to services, you're not, bulldozing existing box gum grassy woodland. And I think increasingly that's where people are going to want to live, with access to Commonwealth Park and the lake. I would certainly love to see more being done in terms of land management and conservation here in the ACT, and maybe let's chat after this, and I'd love to get some ideas. But thank you for the question.
Just a bit of useless trivia first. As our population approaches 600,000, that means we're producing 600 tonnes of CO2 a day. But my real question, I've already put this to Choice. We're being encouraged to put solar panels on our roofs, but when we actually look at our usage, we're actually charged full retail rate for the production that we are actually producing and get a discount for it. And I was having coffee with a person yesterday, and their feed-in tariff was 1 cent per kilowatt. So I put this to Choice that maybe when you're using your own produced power, it should be free, not at a discount. And maybe when you're producing power that goes into the network, it's maybe 50% of the retail rate. And that would be a simple law that could be passed nationally.
It is one of the most tricky things to get right, that I think all the state and territory governments have struggled with, is getting the right mixture of incentives for solar and recognition of people where people have actually been able to move to solar. But one of the tricky things too is how there's still the cost of running the rest of the system, and how you actually try to make sure that that cost is shared equitably. Because if the pendulum swings too far, then there's a risk that the people that haven't been able to afford to, or don't own at their home, have got no ability to access solar power, end up bearing a much greater burden of the costs of running that system. And this is a transitional problem. We will get through it, and the ACT is obviously getting through it much faster than anywhere else in the country. But I think that's the tricky balance for governments, is how to indeed reward people who've been able to take the step to install solar, but just make sure that the costs of the rest of the system are still shared in an equitable way.
Be worth having a chat to Suburb Zero. Who's here from Suburb Zero? Anyone? They're gone.
Oh,
Right up the back. They're looking at a whole bunch of these issues that are part of the challenges with the transition. I'm really hopeful that we can move to more sort of democratized energy system where people who are producing energy are rewarded for that rather than, you know, still trying to apply this old mindset where you have the big generators that are getting the actual money for generating. And then it's just a, you know, nice little add-on if you've got solar into the future where we hopefully have, you know, everyone who can have solar has solar. The generation is going to look very different. So we're going to have to come up with models that take that into account. And we're able to deal with those sort of big peaks and troughs.
Sorry, it wasn't intended to be negative. I'm sorry if it came out that way. But no, I mean, I think it's just a really tricky thing just to get those sort of costs and incentives right. But we'll get there. It is a transition period. This is the trickiest part of it, I think, this period we're in right now.
My questions are for Alan. Going back to the supermarkets and the cost of living. We've seen within the ACT, so Woolworths mentioned they had a spike in theft of groceries and the like, and retailers historically have used shoplifting as a means to increase their prices and that. Currently, but we've got people who are, there's people that are always vulnerable and other people that are now falling below that line that are forced into making decisions between being virtuous and hungry or feeding their families. I'll probably look to your history with legal aid here. Do you see scope for, similar to the drug court setup, where people can answer to these offences, but with the higher likelihood of not coming out with a criminal conviction for a dishonesty offence, because the residual effect of that in the future will impact their employability further, and it's almost as if they're just impossible to get the foot off their throat with it, as well as looking at now we're online after hours courts and the likes, so that people don't have to take time away from work as casuals and then don't get another shift because their employer cottons on and the like.
Look, I think in general, and again, I am really talking with my legal aid background hat on here rather than a choice hat, but in general, wherever we can divert people from the justice system, from the formal parts of the justice system, it always pays off. So giving courts the maximum range of options they can apply, taking into account all of the person's circumstances, and not just sort of having a default that we sort of move to fines that people will never be able to pay, or you know, at worst, incarceration. We should be looking for every opportunity to divert people from the more formal parts of the justice system where that's appropriate in the minds of the court. So yeah, I'm personally in favour of just giving the courts more options in those cases, particularly where you know, if a key cause of behaviour is actually people's economic circumstances.
Good afternoon, Senator Pocock. I'm a 51-year-old single father of 3 who works full-time. The greatest cost of living expense that I've experienced in the last couple of years is a direct result of the astronomical increase in medical bills that I've had to pay, which is a result of the injuries I suffered as a result of the COVID-19 vaccination. My health's deteriorated to the point now that I regularly see cardiologists, neurologists, rheumatologists, naturopaths, because of the neurological, autoimmune and heart conditions that I now suffer from. Prior to this, I rarely ever went to see a doctor, and I didn't even know what a rheumatologist was. As an example of these costs, I reached the Medicare safety limit in the first 4 months of this year, which, as you know, means I was $2,500 out of pocket. Plus there's a lot of other expenses on top of that that aren't covered by Medicare. My life as I knew it is gone, but I'm currently ineligible for compensation under the federal government's vaccine injury compensation scheme because of the narrow eligibility criteria. I've been lucky that I've been able to keep working. I'm in no way an anti-vaxxer. I was in the military for 11 years and all my kids have always been vaccinated. I guess my reason for coming here today is just to find out what discussion is being had, at least privately, in federal government spaces, because it's obviously not getting into the media or being spoken about in any other way. And I would also like to say I voted for you because of the positive agenda that you brought to the election around territory rights, climate change, affordable housing, all those sorts of things. But yeah, I just feel like I've been forgotten.
Well, thank you very much for coming along and sharing that. And I'm really sorry to hear what you're going through. If you're happy to stay, I'd love to chat to you afterwards and see. I'm not, to be upfront, I'm not sort of across the ins and outs of the eligibility for compensation. When it comes to just,
I find quite staggering.
yeah. So if you want to chat afterwards, I'd love to, and can grab someone in the team and take down your details. As far as conversations in there, yeah, there was the long COVID inquiry, but yeah, there haven't been a lot, to be honest. You know, the next sort of big thing that is happening is setting up the Australian Centre for Disease Control, which will look at pandemics, but hopefully other.
Important point I'd like to just raise there. Just I noticed that you abstained from voting on Senator Babbitt's inquiry into excess deaths in Australia since 2021.
Yes.
You know, I'm no Senator Babbitt supporter, but I just, you know, we all know there was very little COVID in Australia in 2021, but excess deaths increased by about 8,000 to 9,000 people. That alone is enough to just raise the question. And I just think it's such an important issue that I just, yeah, I guess, like
Sure.
I said, just.
I'm happy to give you some background on that. So I had a really good discussion with Senator Babbitt about this, and I said to him, if he had referred this to the relevant committee, I would have supported. I think it's well worth looking into. What he was trying to do was to set up a select committee, so a standalone committee where he was the chair of that committee. And I believe that would just be purely political rather than actually looking at the issue, which I think does warrant a look at. That would become a bit of a sort of a politically driven thing where you have someone in control of it who clearly has certain views on COVID and the response and you know what happened in Victoria in particular. And so that was my view, was that given the Senate's resources and the way that it was going to be politicized rather than genuinely looking at the issue, I said to him, I can't vote for it. But I did tell him that if he had have referred it to the relevant committee, I would have supported it. But would be keen to chat afterwards if you're happy to hang around.
Great. Thank you. Time for one or two more.
David, I was here a little late. The first little matter I wanted to raise, is this the first Tuggeranong town hall that you've had, or have you had one previously? And it's such a good opportunity to actually hear you across all the issues. And thanks for it.
No, thanks so much for coming along. This is the second one down here.
It is the second one.
This year we did Belconnen and...
Yeah, I know about some of the others, but I hadn't heard of one in Tuggeranong.
Yeah.
But could I ask a question? I mean, this is like a sort of moving up a bit in scale, but you know, I find the Australian Constitution, with the voice coming and so on, is completely inadequate in so many ways. It's 100+ years out of date in all sorts of respects. And the conversation we've been having today, of course, goes under its aegis, so to speak. I would like to see a much better Australian Constitution with a Bill of Rights that acknowledges the roles of the First Peoples and all those sort of things, and would help sort of progress issues like the abysmal way we've treated refugees. And I noticed there's been no
that hasn't been raised this afternoon. So, I mean, I know it's a huge issue and there seems to be no political interest in it in the major parties, but I think it's a central issue for Australia's future. And I'll stop there. And I wonder if you might care to comment.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a great point. Professor Kim Rubenstein was in front of the Electoral Matters Committee the other day, and I was asking her exactly that about the Constitution and should this be changed over time. And her view was that this is both a foundational document, but something that should reflect who we are and what we want to live by, and that requires updating it and changing it when we believe it's fit and proper to do that. If you look at the history of referendums, not a high success rate in Australia. But I would love to get to the point where people are thinking more about, well, how do we make this document reflect who we are now as a nation? And give Raz a really important point about not having a sort of Human Rights Act or a Bill of Rights, as many countries do. And I think that would have wide-ranging implications for our country, and certainly something that we've been talking to a few various stakeholders and experts about.
Great, thank you. So in considering everyone Sunday afternoon, that is all we have time for today. But if you would like to ask more questions, Dave will be here afterwards, so will Alan. If you would like to know some more or talk some more, you can talk to anyone with a Team Pocock shirt and they will chat some more with you. Thank you guys very much for coming down. The next town hall will be in Gungahlin in November. And
thank you, Jess. Yeah. Thanks so much to Jess Ward-Jones for hosting this one. And thank you very much to Alan again. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming along. See someone in a Team Pocock if you got a question. I'll hang around. Should we go into the foyer? I'll be in the foyer if you want to come and say hi or have a question. And if you want more info about Yes 23, you can talk to Jess.